Hi everyone, this is Justine Allenbach. I'm the Coordinated Entry Specialist with the Center for Housing and Health, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm going to walk you through the assessment workflow of the Coordinated Entry Housing Assessment. Please note this video does not cover a lot about how to create client profiles and all of the logistics of HMIS itself, which is covered in the HMIS Introduction Training. But if you do have further questions, HMIS related, you can always reach out to me, and you can also email the All Chicago HMIS Help Desk, which is just helpdesk@allchicago.org. So let's get started. The first thing for doing a coordinated entry housing assessment is making sure you're in the correct mode. So you go up to the upper right corner, click Enter Data As, and find Coordinated Entry System Skilled Assessors Project. The project ID is 1474, and click Plus. Once you've done that, you'll notice that next to your mode and Enter Data As, it'll say Chicago Coordinated Entry System Skilled Assessors Project, which means you're in the correct mode to start doing coordinated entry housing assessments. If you are not in the correct Chicago Coordinated Entry Skilled Assessor mode, then any assessments you attempt to do will not be actually recorded and would have to be redone. So if you know that you're going to be doing assessments this day, the most important thing is to make sure you start off your day, start off your time in HMIS, getting yourself into the correct mode, because if you forget to do that, again, it's not actually recording the assessments you've done, and you would have to redo them. So now let's hypothetically say that we're working with a client named Tammy Doe. We would first look up Tammy in Client Search. I'm just going to use an exact match here. And so I see Tammy Doe, the client that I'm seeing, does not have any matches that come up when I do a client search. This means that Tammy does not have a profile in HMIS at this time. So I should create a new HMIS profile for Tammy by doing Add New Client with this information. So for any client, single individuals, households, etc., you're always going to do this middle option, Add Client and Add New Household. Because even if someone is just a one individual, we do want to consider them as a household. So always do this middle option, Add Client and Add New Household. So this is when you have the chance to make sure that the client's household is correct. So for the purpose of training, I'm going to say that Tammy actually has one child who's under the age of 18. And so I would make her household type female with child, and I would search up her son. So nothing is coming up here for an exact match. So then I would add the child as well and create a profile for them as long as Tammy, the parent, is comfortable. So now I have both Tammy and Bobby Doe, the single parent with child household that I created, and I'll just press continue. The next thing that it brings you to is an opportunity to just note who is the head of household, and then just create the relationship for the other additional household members. And then you can press Save and Exit. So at this point, we have Tammy Doe's profile. If you were in the Summary tab, you would see that they have the household here, female with child, like we intended. And we would be ready to start doing the Coordinated Entry Housing Assessment at this point. So the first thing we need to do for doing the Coordinated Entry Housing Assessment is double check, make sure we're still in our Chicago Coordinated Entry Skilled Assessor project mode. And then we're going to go to the Entry Exit tab. If a client that you're working with is enrolled in additional projects, you might see more things in this tab, but for a new client such as Tammy, there's not going to be anything listed here. So we'll click Add Entry Exit, and when we're in the correct CES mode, then it's automatically going to pull this up as if we're trying to do an entry for Coordinated Entry and for the Coordinated Entry Housing Assessment. So let's go ahead and click the household and make sure that everyone that is in the household is checked off. And then type is always HUD. And it'll just do a project start date for whenever you were doing this assessment. So once you're opened into the assessment, the first thing it's going to open you into is something called the Standardized Housing Assessment. We like to call these the first tab. The first tab that it opens you into again is called the Standardized Housing Assessment, which is the majority of the assessment itself that you'll complete. So what we'll do here is begin the assessment, and you'll notice throughout the assessment there's some reminders in red that help you remember some important things as you're completing assessments with folks. So it says here the following assessment is meant only for the head of household and should not be completed for other household members. So that's just making sure that the person you're doing the standardized housing assessment for is the head of household, which I am, Tammy Doe. The next thing here is just asking us to make sure that this client is eligible for the assessment. So what we would do is make sure they're eligible, which means the client most likely has to be what is considered literally homeless. And so there's something called the Eligibility Pre-Screener, which helps us determine if somebody is eligible for the Coordinated Entry Housing Assessment. And so what you can do is you can copy and paste this URL and put it into a new browser, and it'll pull up an article from All Chicago describing eligibility in kind of a chart for you, and it'll help you decide if somebody is eligible for sure. But you always know someone is eligible if they've spent at least one night in emergency shelter or a place unfit for habitation, which is the most common situations. But there are some other intricacies to that, so please refer to the Eligibility Pre-Screener if you have any questions or concerns about your client's eligibility. So we're going to say in this hypothetical that Tammy and Bobby Doe have been staying in shelter, and they've been staying in shelter for at least one night, so we'll say yes. The next piece is completing the consent for data sharing for the client as well as additional household members if they'd like. And so the release of information, which is provided by All Chicago, should always be completed before doing a coordinated entry assessment. It does not matter if client already had a release of information in their HMIS profile for a different project enrollment. You do always need to do the client consent for data sharing, consent forms, release of information from All Chicago at this point before continuing an assessment with somebody. So please make sure that you do that. If you have questions about the release of information, I can always refer you to those, and they should also be covered in the HMIS introduction course. So we'll just note yes that we did complete the client consent for data sharing, and we'll say in this case the client chose A, which is the most open sharing option. And then it does give you a note here that if option B is selected, you would need to lock the client profile, and I will show you at the end how to do that. And also if option C was chosen, then do not continue completing the assessment because client has chosen to not share any information, or they do not agree to share information. One other thing to note is that if client chooses, or if client later reveals a few things, such as being HIV positive or actively fleeing domestic violence, we will automatically lock their file, which would be option B. And it's okay to tell clients about that. We can be transparent about changing their file sharing options for their privacy and protection. Moving forward, the next things we see here are some attempt options. These attempts are only if you were working with somebody and were unable to complete the assessment for reasons of severe mental illness, substance use, or other. So if you are working with somebody and you are not able to do the assessment with them, please fill out these assessment attempts here. There's a first and second attempt. Maybe people have been trying a few times with folks. And these are monitored, and for folks that are not able to do the assessment for these reasons, we will do another option with them. There is something called an observational assessment that we've been phasing out, but we have a lot of outreach providers that are able to case conference these situations with us, and then we can prioritize housing for people in these situations. So again, just please make documents or document these attempts at working with somebody that was unable to do the assessment for reasons of severe mental illness, substance use. It could be other things as well. And then we can case conference those situations to make sure that that person has access to the coordinated entry system. Moving into safety, so these are some safety check-ins that we like to ask everybody, and at this point in the assessment, you're able to pause and offer support if client needs. Some clients don't want to pause their assessment for these items, but you can always offer the support at the end as well. So if somebody answered yes to either one of these questions, then again, we would want to change their option for data sharing from A to B if they had chosen A. And then we do want to make sure that they're aware of these resources and just pause to address this crisis need. Moving on, the next element is called the coordinated entry assessment. And what we do here is click Add. We would never have an end date because we want this to stay open, so it's just the day that you're seeing the client. Assessment location, whichever fits best for you. Type, which are options phone, virtual, and in person. And the assessment level will always be housing needs assessment. As a skilled assessor, you will always do housing needs assessment. And then press Save. So again, this is the coordinated entry assessment element, and this only has to be done in the actual project entry. It does not need to be done in interim updates, and I will cover the interim update piece at the end. So the next thing here is client information as well as the assessor's information. So you would just fill this out. Get your phone number in there, the agency, Center for Housing and Health, whatever your agency is, your best contact, and then you're going to fill out the client's information. So if they have an alias, you fill that out. Make sure, again, they're the head of household, the language that they prefer to communicate, gender pronouns, race, ethnicity, social security number, date of birth, quality of date of birth information, client's phone, email, and mailing address. And then this next one is a little bit more complicated, so asking the client if they're currently enrolled in any social service programs. One way of asking this is if the client has a case manager. I found that that makes a little bit more sense. And so they might say, yes, I have a case manager. And you can ask, where do you have that? Maybe they have a case manager at Pacific Garden Mission. And Jane Doe is their case manager. I'm going to get their email. And their phone number. And so this can be really helpful information to have, because clients, if they're actively engaged with a case manager, this is a really good contact for being able to locate them if the client is matched to housing. Similarly, we like to get some alternate contact information for the client. So this gives you an option to list 2 additional contact people for us to be able to locate the client. This is very important because clients' phone numbers themselves often change, and so a phone number that client may have given us at time of doing their assessment or update could very likely have changed. So we just like to ask, is there somebody else that we would be able to contact if your phone number wasn't working? And then you can put that information in here. It could look like this. And then just making sure they're okay if we left those people a voicemail. The next element here is called the notes on contacting client. So it says here, please share ways to contact you if a housing offer is available and the phone number we have for you is not working. This can include eating dinner at a specific place, spending time at a library, attending any program, social media usernames, etc. So if you're curious for a perfect example of this, I have a few of them that I can provide you with, but here's a common example I like to use. So as you can see, this is a really specific location that provides time, area in the library, etc. So client is staying at the Harold Washington Library from 8:30 a.m. until 10:30 a.m. every weekday on the 8th floor by the computers. So this is a much more detailed and helpful note than something that said client stays at Harold Washington Library. So it's beneficial to put yourself in the shoes of people in our continuum of care that are called housing navigators, who are working to find clients that have been matched to housing, and they will physically go out and try to search for people if we have attempted every point of contact via phone, email, etc. So just giving them as much information as possible for being able to possibly locate somebody is really beneficial. Another good example would be client's Facebook name is Tammy Kane. So what if client's Facebook or social media name is actually different than the name they have now? So these things are really important as well. So just keep note of all of the free avenues we have for contacting people via social media like Facebook Messenger, and just supporting any information that you can to our navigators so that we're able to find folks that are matched to housing. So the next element is military service details. So for the purpose of training, we're going to say that this client, Tammy, is a veteran. If client is a veteran, then we'll just get the character of their discharge if they know. And then we're going to do something called an offer of permanent housing, which should always be made to veterans experiencing homelessness. And all we do is click Add, the date that this offer was made, which should just be the same day you're doing the assessment. The type is always Other. As a skilled assessor, it's not your role to know exactly what they're eligible for, so you would just do Other. And if the client accepted this offer of housing, which they normally will, but if they decline, that's okay as well, and just please document that. And that would be it. And so clients that are veterans experiencing homelessness should be contacted within a few weeks with a housing opportunity, depending on what they're eligible for. It's not necessarily always permanent supportive housing. It could also be rapid rehousing, transitional, etc. So we don't know exactly what they're eligible for yet, but they should be contacted with some kind of housing opportunity as a veteran experiencing homelessness. And there's a few resources here that are helpful for connecting your veteran clients. So if you have questions about next steps that you should do for a veteran client, or you just want to make sure they're being accounted for, a really good resource is Jessica Smith at the Corporation for Supportive Housing. Her email is here as well as her phone number. Feel welcome to reach out to her as veteran situations come up for you, because she can be a really great source of support and let you know about all of the veteran resources that are out there. So moving into our length of homelessness section, you're going to note here that it says for those completing a new assessment, please use the current living situation after February 1st, 2021, and not the housing history tool. So again, we're not going to use the housing history tool then. The only reason it's still in here is that we're, still mapping over information from the housing history tool when we switched from this to the current living situation, but you're not going to use it for any clients that you see at this point in time. So you can see here that for the length of homelessness section for the current living situation, we want to document the client's locality overlapping with the past 5-year time frame, housed or unhoused. You're going to enter the actual start date for every location, even if that start date was 8 years ago and the end date was 4 years ago. So it can go a little further back if the end date for one of these situations blends into the 5-year time frame that we're gathering. And then also the exit date should be the subsequent entry date, which I'll show you what that looks like. It also says do not put an end date for the most recent entry, because that will reflect that the client is no longer experiencing homelessness. And again, I will show you how to do that. So we'll go down to this current living situation tool, and we're going to start documenting where the client's been staying for the past 5-year time frame. So I find it most helpful to work my way from now back to 5 years. And so if I was speaking with this client, let's say hypothetically, Tammy Doe had told me she's been staying in shelter for the past 1 year. So I would just change this. I'll start it at the beginning of the month. Maybe she said she started staying in shelter in June of 2020. So I'll have my start date here. And then if she was still actively staying in this shelter, we're not going to have an end date. Information date is just the day we're doing the assessment. Current living situation can serve as where they currently are. Like in this situation, it is where they actively are, but it could also just be the type of place for that period of time you're describing. So this would be emergency shelter. And then we can use this other line as a way to make a brief note about maybe the name of the shelter. But there's not a lot of space here, and the note is not necessarily required, but if you do know what shelter the client was staying at. That can be helpful information. And then the rest you do not have to fill out at all as the skilled assessor. The rest of this information is not relevant to the skilled assessor role, so that is all you would need to do. And then you would press save. So now we have the past 1 year time frame, and we're going to need to keep moving our way backwards. So let's say that before entering shelter in June of 2020 last year, Tammy and her son had been staying with a family member for 2 years. So the end date for this one is going to be the subsequent start date of the other, so that would be June 1, 2020, which lines up with this start date. But then the start date for this period of time would be 2 years if she's reporting 2 years staying with family members. And then we don't need to put an address or any other notes about this housed situation. And again, we don't need to fill this section out, so you can press save. And then it would look like that. So our end date matches up with the next start date, so we don't have time gaps. I know it doesn't perfectly work out that way, but just for the purpose of data, we do like to have it match. And so now we've gone back to 2018, so we need to keep moving further back 2 more years. And so maybe before staying with a family member or friend, Tammy had had her own place. So we'll make this end date line up with the other start date. She had her own rental, her own place. We don't need to get an address or any further information. Save. So the current living situation tool is often a lot more complicated than this example, but this is just a simple example for learning purposes of how to complete that. So this goes back 5 years, so we would be able to stop completing it at this point. Has an open end date, meaning the client is still actively experiencing homelessness, and all of our end dates line up with the subsequent start date, which is also something that's important here. So moving on to our housing history drop-down section, it tells you that the following housing history drop-down questions need to match the entries in your current living situation. So you can just use the information you collected here to answer these questions. So the prior living situation is wherever the client stayed the night before the assessment was completed, and it could be where they've been staying for multiple nights before you completed the assessment, but we just like to make sure that it's at least 1 night in a literally homeless situation, because that's just another verification that this person is eligible for the assessment. Some of these questions are a little confusing in their wording, so note how I'm hovering my mouse over the question. If you hover your mouse over the question and click, it will pull up a question description for you to kind of clear up what this question is getting at. So prior living situation for this client, Tammy, is emergency shelter. The housing status is going to be category 1 homeless. Again, to define those categories, you can click on the housing status question and it'll describe that for you. Length of stay in previous place, so length of stay in this emergency shelter is going to be 1 year or longer. An approximate date homelessness started should be whenever this episode of homelessness started. So again, lining up with our current living situation, that would be June 1st, 2020. Next, it asks, regardless of where they stayed last night, the number of times client has been on the streets, an emergency shelter, or safe haven in the past 3 years, including today. For this client, it would just be 1. And then the total number of months homeless on the street or in emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years would be 12 months for this client. Is this the place that you typically sleep? For this client, we would say yes. And then it has a few follow-up questions. If yes and client is staying in a place not meant for human habitation, then it has a few follow-up questions here, followed by a couple more questions on the living situation. So it's another opportunity to just briefly describe where the client is staying if you feel like you were not able to capture something about maybe the shelter or where they're staying in general in the current living situation. We don't need to have extensive notes about this. We don't need information about their past or their housed situations, but this is really just further information about how we'd be able to contact them right now. And then this question here, that if client is staying in a situation that falls under a place not meant for habitation, to just check in with them and see if they're staying in those places not meant for habitation with children. If client answers yes to this question, we just want to pause and immediately offer support in calling 311 for shelter. This does not trigger any kind of DCFS involvement or like child protective services. This is just purely for the skilled assessor to take a moment to pause and offer support in getting into shelter, which would be by calling 311. Next would be a few CHA pre-screen questions. So just asking if this applies to if any of these apply to your client. Just answer them honestly or whatever the client reports to you. And this is not saying that they wouldn't be able to receive a housing match if they answered yes to any of this. We just would not match them to CHA housing, which does have restrictions on these elements. So the next component is household details. So note there's another red note here that says, if not already completed, remember to complete the sub-assessments for additional household members within the Household Member Details tab. And I'll show you guys how to get into that tab at the end here. At this point, you might want to pause and go into the Household Member Details tab, but I think it flows best to just do it at the end, so I'll show you how to do that here in a second. So this household size is 2 with 1 adult and 1 child. We'll say the child is 12, male. If there was more, we could fill that out. If the client you're assessing is youth, which is everyone aged 18 to 24, you could ask them this question. You ask everybody if they would be comfortable with shared spaces, which is essentially asking if they would be okay in a single room occupancy, an SRO. We then ask if there's any sides of the city or any part of the city that client would refuse to live if offered a housing option there. Maybe client says hypothetically they would not accept housing on the north side. Asking if they have any income, so maybe they receive income from a few different sources. Using that income information based on their household size to determine the AMI. And these next 2 questions here of exploring ways to increase income through work, you can skip. These are going to be removed from the assessment in the near future, and unfortunately these questions do not connect people to employment services, so you can just leave these blank and do not have to ask clients about those questions. So at this point in the assessment, we've essentially completed the entire standardized housing assessment tab. So it's just going to give you a reminder here to complete the appropriate VI for the household in the VI and disability tab, which we'll move into next. And then it also just mentions documentation, so just if possible to make a copy and upload in the client's HMIS client profile tab. Any documents such as an ID, social security card, some of those essentials that people may have on them are helpful to upload now because they are things they would need for a housing match in the future. So if you're able to get those uploaded, that can be really helpful. These next questions are only for partners at CES and Veteran Affairs teams, so you can skip these unless this applies to you. And then we can press save. So after we've pressed save and this information in the standardized housing assessment is saved, we can scroll up and go to the VI and Disability tab, which is the second part of the assessment. It's just asking me to fill these out because I didn't complete every element during this training video. But this is a good reminder if you forgot to do something in the standardized housing assessment, they're going to let you know about that, and you can go back in and make sure you answer everything. So I've gone into our VI and Disability tab here, which is kind of in the upper left corner. Again, it's going to make sure you completed that supplemental element of the consent forms. And if the individual declined to share anything. So the next is asking if the individual has any disabling conditions. So maybe in this hypothetical, client has a physical disability as well as a mental health disability. And then asking if client would need their place to be wheelchair accessible. And so the next thing is completing the appropriate vulnerability index, or VI. So you're going to complete the appropriate VI based on whatever the household is. And so it gives you a description here of which VI you should complete. For this client, we would complete the family VI because our client hypothetically is someone who's over the age of 25 years old and does have a child under age 18 in their care. So we would complete the family VI in this situation, which all you do for that is click Add. It opens you into the VI, and there's a series of questions here. Date you completed can just always be the same date that you're doing this assessment. And then it's going to ask you some questions here like length of time homeless, about disabilities. For the family VI, there's a lot of questions family related, such as like child welfare, age you had your first child, etc. And so as you can see, there's a lot of very sensitive questions in the VI. This applies for all of them. So please take some time looking through the VIs before you start doing assessments and just making sure you understand for yourself how to ask these kinds of questions, what feels best for you. If you need some more support in how to provide trauma-informed care in completing these sections, please feel free to reach out to myself, Justine Allenbach, anytime, and I can offer some more support and resources for asking these kinds of questions of participants. And I do understand that there's a lot of sensitive information here. So again, just please take a look at all of these VIs before diving into completing assessments with folks so you kind of know what all of the questions look like. So this last thing in the VI and Disability tab is some observational questions. So just an opportunity for you as the assessor to know if you feel like maybe this client is underreporting their disabling conditions. And a common one could be that the client has maybe a severe mental health condition and does not have insight to that condition. And this is just an observer question, so you are not asking the participant that you're assessing these questions. This is just for you to answer. So then you can press save. And the very last thing, which only applies if client has additional household members, is to do our household member details sub-assessment. So then you'll go to this tab that's kind of in the right section of our tabs here, just to the right of the standardized housing assessment. And you only need to do this for additional household members. It is not for the head of household, which is noted here. So I'm just going to click on Bobby Doe, who's the child in the situation. we'll say this is child's birthday, pronouns. I'm just filling all of this out as hypothetically. And that's what that looks like. So this is the sub-assessment for household members. It's very short. You would just have to do it for any additional household members, but not the head of household. So now we can press save and exit. Because we've completed everything. We completed the standardized housing assessment. We completed the vulnerability index and disability tab. And because we did have household members besides the head of household, we completed our household member details sub-assessment. Save and exit. So last but not least, I'm going to show you how to do an interim update. You should always just do an interim update if you're updating a client's information. If they already have a coordinated entry project start date and project enrollment, you never want to do a second project enrollment. We always just want one active project enrollment, and any changes to that assessment that we did would be done using an interim update. So you would just click this notebook here, add interim review. You can always just say update. Again, just click the household, make sure all of the household members that are still actively in that household are clicked. Save and continue. And then it's going to open us up into the assessment the same way it looks in the project entry. There's no different way that this looks. It's exactly the same, but then you would just be able to change any information that you needed to. So maybe client does not have this same case manager, and we're just changing the case manager's information. Something like that. There's of course other things that can change here, where client is staying, notes on contacting, many things, but it's going to look exactly the same, like I mentioned, as the actual assessment, the project start date that you completed. So it'll look, again, exactly the same, and it's just an opportunity for you to make any changes to the assessment that the client might be reporting. So once you've had some interim updates completed, then you'll start to see the number of interim updates listed here. One thing to note is that the interim update policy, which is a new policy we're going to start implementing for our continuum of care, is that everybody needs to have an interim update done every 90 days. So again, every 90 days, somebody would need to have their coordinated entry assessment updated, which they can do with any skilled assessor, but one particularly helpful resource for doing interim updates is using the coordinated entry call center, which is open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. And you can find that call center's number on the Corporation for Supportive Housing's coordinated entry website, which is also linked in this training. One last thing I'll show you in this assessment workflow piece is how we lock a client's record. So again, I mentioned if somebody chose option B, or we automatically chose option B for that client's privacy and protection, we do want to lock their file. You can see here we have a green unlocked file for this client, but if they had chosen option B, all we do is click and just do a minus, remove this global visibility, exit, and now it's locked. Very simple. So that was the assessment workflow. Again, there's a lot of different types of assessments and different situations for all of the clients and participants that we see and that we assess. And so there's a lot of different situations that may come up for you and questions that will arise as you start completing assessments. So please feel welcome to reach out anytime. I can always offer one-on-one support and further training support in general. We appreciate your time and thank you for completing this training. Thanks so much.